Hello everybody, welcome back to Book of Kings, where we discuss topics such as history, religion, philosophy, psychology, culture, and more, and the way that they all interact with one another. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to receive a notification every time I release a new video. Hope you enjoy. When talking about modern intractable conflicts, there was one conflict which likely comes to mind more than any other as being unparalleled with regard to its length as well as its level of controversy and divisiveness, and that is the Israel Palestine conflict. However, in order to thoroughly understand the conflict, one must understand its origins. Following the expulsion of the Jews from the region of Judea during antiquity, the Jews would form diaspora communities in the surrounding regions of the Middle East and Europe, and the region would gradually develop a Christian and then Arabic-speaking Muslim majority by the Middle Ages. Jews would migrate to the Holy Land from the 13th to 19th centuries for religious purposes and to escape persecution in Europe. However, in the late 1880s, the modern Zionist movement, led by Theodor Herzl, would facilitate the organized migration of Jews to the Ottoman region of Palestine with the objective of establishing a Jewish state, initiating what are known as the First and Second Aliyahs, or migrations, in the years prior to World War I. It was the outbreak of World War I which would set in motion a series of events which would bring Zionist aspirations for a Jewish state within reach. Now, the Ottoman Empire had been witnessing a period of decline since the 1800s and had witnessed the loss of many of its territories to rebellion and would soon witness further rebellion within its domain. With the outbreak of World War I, in which the Ottomans would side with Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, forming the Central Powers, one of its rivals within the Allied powers, the British Empire, would work to persuade the Arabs within the Ottoman Empire to rise up and pursue independence. From July 1915 to March 1916, a series of letters would be exchanged between the Sharif of Mecca, the semi-autonomous ruler of the Islamic holy city of Mecca and its surrounding areas, Hussein bin Ali, and the British Lieutenant Colonel Henry McMahon, known as the McMahon-Hussein Correspondence, where the British would persuade the Arabs, under the lead of the Sharif, to rise up against the Ottoman Empire in exchange for the British recognizing Arab independence under the rule of the Hashemite dynasty of Hussein bin Ali in the Arab-majority regions, which according to the boundaries proposed by Hussein would include the Arabian Peninsula, excluding parts of modern-day Yemen, Iraq, and the Levant, or Greater Syria, which also includes the modern-day nations of Lebanon, Jordan, and Israel Palestine. Within this correspondence, McMahon and Hussein would disagree with regard to the specific boundaries of this independent Arab territory, with McMahon proposing exceptions to the boundaries put forth by Hussein, instead proposing that, quote, portions of Syria lying to the west of the districts of Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Aleppo, unquote, generally corresponding to the Hatay province of modern-day Turkey, the modern nation of Lebanon, and the majority Alawite territory between the two, should be excluded from the territory requested by Hussein, as they quote-unquote cannot be said to be purely Arab, likely referencing the Christian and/or Alawite religion of the inhabitants of those regions. Hussein would argue that despite much of said areas being majority Christian, they were still fundamentally Arab and had their rights protected based upon the precedent set by previous caliphs. Despite his objections, the agreement would move forward without McMahon conceding to Hussein's stated concerns, and the conflicting interpretations of the stated boundaries would lead to much dissent in the years to come. The Arabs would nonetheless rise up in revolt against the Ottomans, and during the revolt, thousands of proclamations would be dropped over the Arab-majority regions of the Ottoman Empire, such as Palestine, with a message from Hussein on one side, stating that an agreement had been made between the British and the Arabs, securing Arab independence. In spite of this agreement, in May 1916, the British would enter into a secret agreement with the French known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement, whereby upon the impending fall of the Ottoman Empire, the British and French would divide its territories outside of the Arabian Peninsula, with the British gaining control of modern-day Israel Palestine, as well as Jordan and southern Iraq, and the French gaining control of southern Turkey, Kurdistan, Syria, and Lebanon. The following year, in 1917, the British would enter into another agreement which would seemingly conflict with Hussein's correspondence with McMahon, and that was the Balfour Declaration, whereby British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour would send a statement to British Jewish community leader Lord Rothschild declaring British support for a quote-unquote national home for the Jewish people in the region of Palestine upon the impending fall of the Ottoman Empire. The following year, in December 1917, the contents of the Sykes-Picot Agreement would be made known to the world when, after the overthrow of the Russian Empire during the Bolshevik Revolution, the Bolsheviks would release a copy of the agreement to the public, which the government of the Russian Empire had been made aware of, causing embarrassment to the Allies and fomenting distrust between them and the Allied Arabs, with Arab leaders considering the McMahon-Hussein correspondence to have been violated and prompting Colonel McMahon to resign from his post. The Ottoman Empire would ultimately be defeated in 1918 with the end of World War I, and with the exception of the Hejaz region of the Western Arabian Peninsula, which would become the independent Kingdom of Hejaz under the rule of Hussein bin Ali, the Arab lands of the Ottoman Empire would come under Allied occupation, with the British occupying Palestine and Iraq, and the French occupying Syria and Lebanon, despite an attempt by Hussein's son Faisal to declare an independent kingdom in Syria, which the French would put down with military force, quashing Arab aspirations for independence. It was following the end of World War I at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 and 1920 that the leadership of the Zionist movement would stake their claims to the occupied region of Palestine based on promises made in the Balfour Declaration, with leader of the Zionist organization and future First President of Israel, Chaim Weizmann, who had been a driving force behind the Balfour Declaration, proclaiming the objective of Zionists to quote-unquote make Palestine as Jewish as England is English. Further, during the Paris Peace Conference, Hussein bin Ali would refuse to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, considering the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Balfour Declaration a violation of the McMahon-Hussein correspondence. An offshoot of the Paris Peace Conference, the 1919 Inter-Allied Commission on Mandates in Turkey, also known as the King Crane Commission, would be held consisting primarily of an American delegation which would submit a report to the Paris Peace Conference in August 1919. Based on the requirement set forth in the Balfour Declaration that, quote, nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, unquote, the Commission recommended that, quote, only a greatly reduced Zionist program be attempted by the Peace Conference, and even that only very gradually initiated, stating that, quote-unquote, Zionists look forward to a practically complete dispossession of the present non-Jewish inhabitants of Palestine by various forms of purchase. The report would refer to the principle that the desires of the local population should be taken into account, and noted that there was widespread anti-Zionist sentiments in Palestine and Syria, with nearly 90% of the Palestinian population opposing the Zionist project based upon a survey of public opinion conducted by the Commission, additionally noting that Jews made up only 10% of the population of Palestine at the time. It further noted that being that the land was considered holy to Christians and Muslims as well as Jews, it should not come under solely Jewish sovereignty. They expressed that they would have no opposition to Jews migrating to the region to live as Jewish Syrian citizens, but noted that a Jewish state could not be created, quote, without the gravest trespass upon the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, unquote. Further cautioning that, quote, if the American government decided to support the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, they are committing the American people to the use of force in that area, since only by force can a Jewish state in Palestine be established or maintained, unquote. The Commission would recommend Palestine to be included within a united Syrian state, with holy sites being under the care of an international, inter-religious commission, where Jews would also have representation. The future of the region, however, would have already been determined at the Paris Peace Conference based upon the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and by the time the report was finished, the recommendations were not taken into consideration. A third wave of Zionist organized migrations, or Third Aliyah, would take place from 1919 to 1923, triggered by the Russian Revolution, which would include the settlement of 40,000 Jews in the region of Palestine, and would include notable migrants such as future Israeli Prime Ministers David Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir. Violence would soon break out between the local Arab population and Jewish settlers, notably the Nebi Musa riots, which would take place in Jerusalem between April 4th and April 7th, 1920, being preceded by speeches by Arab leaders referencing Zionist migrations and previous confrontations between Arabs and Jews, and would result in the death of 5 Jews and the injury of several hundred, and the death of 4 Arabs and the injury of 18, as well as the injury of 7 Brits. April 25, 1920, at the post-World War I San Remo Conference, Great Britain would be assigned a mandate of the newly formed League of Nations over the region of Palestine, establishing British rule in the region. The British would conduct a royal commission known as the Palin Commission to investigate the cause of the Nebi Musa riots as well as the cause of inter-ethnic animosities within the region. The Commission would submit a report on July 1, 1920, expressing the opinion that dissatisfaction on part of the Arab population of Palestine stemmed from disappointment and a feeling of betrayal due to promises made to them by the British not being fulfilled in line with commitments made by the British within the Balfour Declaration, quote, fear of Jewish competition and domination justified by experience and the apparent control exercised by the Zionists over the administration and Zionist indiscretion and aggression since the Balfour Declaration aggravating such fears, unquote, as well as anti-British and anti-Zionist propaganda. Additionally, on July 1st, the British would select their High Commissioner to oversee the Mandate of Palestine, Herbert Samuel, a selection which would cause resentment amongst the Arab majority of Palestine due to Samuel being well known to be a Zionist. In light of Hussein bin Ali's previous refusal to ratify the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, in 1921 the British would propose a treaty to Hussein whereby he would accept the mandate system, which Hussein would ultimately decline to sign, stating that he would not quote-unquote affix his name to a document assigning Palestine to the Zionists and Syria to foreigners. On March 25, 1921, after the fall of the independent kingdom of Syria to the French, Transjordan, now known simply as Jordan, which formed part of the territory of the Kingdom of Syria, would be added to the Mandate of Palestine by the British government. However, Transjordan would be exempt from the policies regarding Jewish settlement per the Transjordan Memorandum, drafted on September 16, 1922, as an addendum to the Mandate, with most official documents referring to them as 2 separate mandates. The specific boundaries were described, allowing for the separate administration of Transjordan, being referred to by British Colonel Administrator John Shuckburgh as quote-unquote not part of Palestine, but part of the area administered by the British under the authority of the Mandate of Palestine. This would earn criticism from members of the revisionist variant of Zionism founded by Ze'ev Jabotinsky, which would also include future Jewish paramilitary groups such as Irgun, which Jabotinsky would lead, and Lehi, also known as the Stern Gang, who would advocate the establishment of a Jewish majority not only in Mandatory Palestine west of the Jordan River, but also in Transjordan, and would claim that the move regarding Transjordan reduced the area of land that a Jewish state could be established upon. On July 10, 1922, the Negev region in modern-day southern Israel would be added to the Mandate of Palestine, with subsequent requests from the ruler of Transjordan and son of Hussein bin Ali, Abdullah, for the region to be added to Transjordan being rejected. In 1922, the League of Nations would officially grant Britain's mandate over Palestine under guidelines which included the promises to the Jewish people of a Jewish national home set forth in the Balfour Declaration, as well as requirements related to the independence of the local Arab population. Tensions would continue to rise between the native Arab population of Palestine and the increasing number of Jewish settlers, resulting in Arab riots on Jewish settler communities and Jewish retaliatory attacks such as the Jaffa Riots of 1921, which would begin as a clash between 2 Jewish groups but then would progress into an Arab attack on Jews, followed by retaliatory attacks by Jews on Arabs, which resulted in 47 Jews being killed, with 146 injured, and 48 Arabs killed, with 72 injured, mostly at the hands of the military and police. High Commissioner Samuel would appoint a commission known as the Haycraft Commission to determine the causes of the Arab violence, which would report in October 1921 that the violence was triggered by a clash between rival Jewish communist and socialist groups. However, the fundamental cause of the violence was, quote, discontent with and hostility to the Jews due to political and economic causes and connected with Jewish immigration and with their conception of Zionist policy as derived from Jewish exponents, unquote, stating that Palestinians feared that Jewish immigration would result in unemployment in the short term and political and economic subjugation in the long term. In order to attempt to meet Palestinian demands, the British would establish the Supreme Muslim Council to administer religious endowments and appoint religious judges, and in January 1922 would allow the election of popular Palestinian nationalist, Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Mohammed Amin al-Husseini, as president, a figure who was a vocal opponent of Zionism and actively opposed Jewish immigration into Palestine. Additionally, in June 1922, at the request of then Secretary of State of the Colonies, Winston Churchill, partly in response to the Jaffa Riots, the Churchill White Paper would be drafted, which would clarify that the Balfour Declaration did not endorse, quote, the disappearance or subordination of the Arabic population, language, or customs in Palestine, or the imposition of Jewish nationality upon the inhabitants of Palestine as a whole, but rather the further development of the existing Jewish community, unquote, re-emphasizing that a Jewish national home was to be founded within Palestine, as opposed to the entirety of Palestine being converted into a Jewish national home. The paper noted that these limitations on a Jewish national home were made prior to the confirmation of the Mandate of Palestine by the League of Nations, and this caveat was accepted at the time by the executive of the Zionist organization, and that Arab fears were, quote, partly based on exaggerated interpretations of the Balfour Declaration, unquote, and that there should be no need for alarm. It additionally called for limiting Jewish immigration in line with the economic capacity of the territory to integrate new migrants. On October 3, 1922, the British would complete their first census of the Mandate of Palestine. Amongst the reported population of 757,182, the religious demographics of the territory consisted of 590,890 Muslims, or 78% of the population, 83,794 Jews, or 11% of the population, 73,024 Christians, or 9.6% of the population, 7,028 Druze, or 1% of the population, and a population of 992 consisting of various other religious groups of smaller numbers. From 1924 to 1929, another wave of Jewish migration to Palestine, known as the Fourth Aliyah, would take place, which would result in the settlement of roughly 80,000 Jews in Palestine, primarily from Poland, escaping an economic crisis and anti-Jewish policies. A fifth Aliyah would take place between 1929 and 1939, whereby 25,000 to 30,000 Jews would settle in Palestine in order to escape the rising persecution of Jews in 1930s Europe due to the rise of Nazism. On August 25, 1933, during the period of the Fifth Aliyah, an agreement would be signed between Nazi Germany and Zionist German Jews known as the Haavara Agreement, which would allow Jews fleeing persecution by the Nazi regime to transfer a portion of their assets to mandatory Palestine. The agreement would prove controversial, being criticized by revisionist Zionist leader Ze'ev Jabotinsky and some non-Zionist Jews, as well as being criticized by members of the Nazi Party and the German public, with Hitler's support for the plan being unclear despite him supporting it from September 1937 to 1939. The plan would provide German Jews with a means of leaving an increasingly antagonistic Germany and allowed Nazi Germany to facilitate the migration of Jews out of Germany and broke the anti-Nazi boycott of 1933. Confrontation would take place again between the local Arab inhabitants of Palestine and Jewish migrants when in August 1929, 300 youth subscribing to the revisionist variant of Zionism marched to the western wall of the former Jewish temple where the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam, currently stands, chanting quote-unquote, "The wall is ours." This would be followed by counter-demonstrations by a group of 2,000 Muslims, which would result in the death of a Jewish youth and the retaliatory killings of a random Arab youth, which would then escalate into the 1929 Palestine Riots. During the course of the riots, 133 Jews would be killed and 339 injured, the majority unarmed, with 116 Arabs killed and 332 wounded, with the majority killed by British mandatory police suppression of the riots, and roughly 20 killed by Jewish attacks and indiscriminate gunfire from British police. Following the violence, the British would appoint the Shah Commission to investigate the cause of the violence, to which they would conclude that the cause was, quote, Arab feeling of animosity towards Jews consequent upon the disappointment of their political and national aspirations and fear for their economic future, unquote, as well as Arab fears of Jewish migrants as, quote, not only as a menace to their livelihood, but a potential overlord of the future, unquote, and additionally concluded that the event which contributed most to the outbreak of violence was the Zionist demonstration at the Western Wall. Based on the recommendation of the Shaw Commission, an additional commission known as the Hope-Simpson Inquiry would be established to address immigration, land settlement, and agricultural development in the Mandate of Palestine, which would issue a report in October 1930 stating that land acquisition by Zionists and its result on local Arabs had the effect that, quote, not only can he never hope to lease or cultivate it, but by the stringent provisions of the lease of the Jewish National Fund, he is deprived forever from employment on the land, unquote. The report further concluded that Arab fears of the adverse impact of Zionist colonization were well-founded, stating that, quote, the Arab population already regards the transfer of land to Zionist hands with dismay and alarm. These cannot be dismissed as baseless in light of the Zionist policy described above, unquote. Further stating that Zionist labor policies resulted in the issue of unemployment among Arabs being quote-unquote serious and widespread, further stating that, quote, there can be no doubt that there is at present time unemployment among Arab craftsmen and among Arab laborers, and that, quote-unquote, Arab unemployment is serious and general. In regard to the Zionist assessment that Arab workers benefited from Jewish migration, the report stated that, quote, the policy of the Jewish Labor Federation is successful in impeding the employment of Arabs in Jewish colonies and in Jewish enterprises everywhere. There is therefore no relief to be anticipated from an extension of Jewish enterprise unless some departure from existing practice is effected, unquote. March 30, the Secretary of State of the colony at the time, Lord Passfield, wrote in a cabinet paper that stated, quote, in the Balfour Declaration, there is no suggestion that the Jews should be accorded a special or favored position in Palestine as compared with the Arab inhabitants of the country, or that claims of Palestinians to enjoy self-government should be curtailed in order to facilitate the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Zionist leaders have not concealed and do not conceal their opposition to the grant of any measure of self-government to the people of Palestine, either now or for many years to come. Many of them even go so far as to claim that the provision of Article 2 of the Mandate constitutes a bar to compliance with the demand of the Arabs for any measure of self-government. In line with the provisions of Article 22 of the Covenant and of the provisions made to Arabs on several occasions, that claim is inadmissible, unquote. Additionally, on October 20, 1930, in response to the Hope-Simpson Commission's investigation into the cause of the 1929 Palestine Riots, Passfield would issue a white paper known as the Passfield White Paper, which would state that it found the Zionist policy of employing only Jewish labor and evicting Palestinians from purchased land as damaging to the economic development of the native Arab population, and concluded that Jewish immigration to Palestine was taking land away from Arab farmers, that the future sale of land to Jewish settlers should be restricted, and that levels of Arab unemployment should be considered when deciding what levels of Jewish immigration to Palestine should be permitted, with the letter additionally stating that it would like to provide justice to the quote-unquote non-Jewish sections of the community, while ultimately confirming that the policy was to continue to support Jewish immigration to Palestine, which would result in increased Jewish immigration to the region in the 1930s in response to rising anti-Semitism in Europe. On November 18, 1931, an additional census of mandatory Palestine was conducted by the British, with this being the final census they would conduct. The census would report a total population of 1,035,821, which increased by 36.8%, with the Jewish population more than doubling, with an increase of 108.4%. The population broken down on religious lines would report 759,717 Muslims, or 73% of the population, 174,610 Jews, or 17% of the population, 91,398 Christians, or 9% of the population, 9,148 Druze, or just under 1% of the population, as well as a population of 953 consisting of various miscellaneous groups in smaller numbers. The discrepancy between the two censuses, as well as records of births, deaths, and immigration, led the authors of the census to determine that illegal immigration accounted for 9,000 of the Jewish population and 4,000 of the Arab population. By 1936, the Jewish population of Mandatory Palestine had increased to nearly 30% of the population. In response to a 6-month-long Arab general strike, the British would convene the Peel Commission, which would publish a report July 7, 1937, stating that the League of Nations mandate had become unmanageable and called for the partition of Mandatory Palestine between its Arab and Jewish population. This would be rejected by the Arab Higher Committee, headed by Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Muhammad Amin al-Husseini, which instead called for an independent state of Palestine, which protected the rights of its Jewish minority, as well as British interests, and demanded a halt to Jewish immigration and land purchase, arguing that the creation of a Jewish state and the absence of an independent Palestine was a betrayal of their word by the British. Abdullah of Jordan would call for the plan to be accepted based upon the perceived realities of the situation. However, he called for a modification of the borders and Arab administration of the neutral areas. The Zionist leadership was divided on the issue. However, the partition plan is generally believed to have not been unequivocally rejected, as delegates encouraged further negotiations on the matter. Zionist leader and future Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion would express in a letter to his son in 1937 that partition would be an initial step to quote-unquote possession of the land as a whole, sentiments which would be shared by Chaim Weizmann. He would additionally state that, quote, "What we want is not that the country be united and whole, but that the united and whole country be Jewish," unquote. He would further express that a Jewish army would authorize Jewish settlement in the rest of the country with or without the permission of the native Arab population, and when the partition plan was rejected by the Zionist Congress based on the premise that Jews had the right to settle anywhere in Palestine, Ben-Gurion is quoted as proclaiming to the Congress that he saw in the plan, quote-unquote, "gradual conquest of all of Palestine." Additionally, in 1937, Zionist Field Battalion leader Yitzhak Sadeh would write the Avner Plan, which foresaw Zionist forces going far beyond the boundaries of the partition plan, consisting of the conquest of Galilee and the north of the region of Palestine, the West Bank, and Jerusalem, a plan which would lay the foundation for Plan Dalet, or Plan D, which would later be implemented in 1948. Zionist leadership would express concern at Arab resistance to Jewish settlement in Palestine, with David Ben-Gurion stating in 1938 that, quote, "A people which fights against the usurpation of its land will not tire so easily. When we say that the Arabs are the aggressors and we defend ourselves, this is only half true. Politically, we are the aggressors and they defend themselves. The country is theirs because they inhabit it, whereas we want to come here and settle down, and in their view, we want to take away from them their country," unquote. Beginning in 1936, continuing through 1939, the Arabs of Palestine would wage a popular uprising against the British administration of Mandatory Palestine, calling for Arab independence and an end to the policy of unrestricted Jewish migration and land purchases aimed at establishing a Jewish national home in Palestine. The revolt would ultimately be suppressed by British forces and Jewish militias, and by the end of the revolt, more than 5,000 Arabs, 400 Jews, and 200 British would be killed, with nearly 1,500 Arabs being wounded and nearly 1,300 detained, and in total, 10% of the Arab adult male population would be killed, wounded, imprisoned, or exiled. In late 1937, the Arab Higher Committee, led by Mufti of Jerusalem Amin al-Husseini, would be outlawed, and al-Husseini would flee Palestine for his role in leading the Arab Revolt, as well as later being charged in absentia with inciting the Nebi Musa riots with an inflammatory speech. Following having fled Palestine, al-Husseini would collaborate with Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany in resisting the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, stating to Hitler in 1931 that Arabs and Germany were, quote, "natural friends because they had the same enemies, namely the English, the Jews, and the Communists," unquote. Additionally stating, quote, "I have considered Germany to be a friendly country because it was not a colonizing country and it never harmed any Arab or Islamic country, and because it was fighting our colonial and Zionist enemies, and because the enemy of your enemy is your friend. And I was certain that Germany's victory would definitely save our countries from the danger of Zionism and colonialism," unquote. He would additionally express to Nazi leader Heinrich Himmler his desire that Jewish immigrants to Palestine, quote-unquote, return to their countries of origin, something which Himmler would refuse. From February 7th to March 1939, the British would call together Arab and Zionist representatives for the London Conference to plan the future governance of Palestine and to end the Mandate. In response to the Arab Revolt, the British would issue a white paper in May 1939, which would call for the establishment of a Jewish national home within an independent Palestinian state within the next 10 years, rejecting the partition plan proposed by the Peel Commission, as well as limiting Jewish migration to 75,000 for 5 years, and leaving further immigration to be determined by the local Arab majority, policies which would remain in place until the end of the British Mandate in Palestine. The White Paper of 1939 was rejected by the representatives of the Palestinian Arab parties who were acting under the influence of Amin al-Husseini. However, more moderate Arabs, such as the National Defense Party, were prepared to accept the paper. The Jews of Palestine would outright reject the paper and would rise up in rebellion against the British in what is known as the Jewish Insurgency in Mandatory Palestine, which would last from 1944 to 1948. During this insurgency, Jewish militias such as Irgun, who in the second half of 1940 would contact representatives from fascist Italy offering to cooperate against the British, as well as Leahy, would utilize violence in an attempt to evict the British from Palestine in order to allow unrestricted Jewish migration to facilitate the formation of an independent Jewish state, including attacks such as the bombing of the King David Hotel carried out by Irgun, which would kill 91 and injure 46 people from various nationalities, including Arabs, Brits, and Jews. The Zionists would also stage an illegal immigration campaign from 1920 to 1948 known as Aliyah Bet, or Aliyah Plan B, which would dramatically increase from 1939 to 1948 in violation of the White Paper, primarily composed of Jewish refugees escaping Nazi Germany and later Holocaust survivors. According to official reports, between 1920 and 1945, 367,845 Jewish migrants would legally migrate to Mandatory Palestine, and additionally, 50,000 to 60,000 would migrate illegally, with immigration accounting for the majority of the increase in Palestine's Jewish population. In 1942, Zionist leadership would convene a conference at the Biltmore Hotel in New York City, which would take place from May 9th to May 11th, 1942, known as the Biltmore Conference, which would include 600 delegates and Zionist leaders from 18 countries. The conference would result in the approval of an 8-point plan which would diverge from previous ambiguous proposals for a Jewish national home in Palestine, consisting of autonomous Jewish regions within an Arab state, to explicitly calling for the creation of a quote-unquote Jewish Commonwealth, with the United States having the ultimate say in the quest for Jewish statehood in what is viewed by many historians as tantamount to a coup d'etat within the Zionist movement by the avant-garde of the movement, with the Yishuv-based Jewish agency, represented by future First Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, advocating for immediate statehood established in all of Palestine, and if necessary, armed resistance to achieve said goals, against the more moderate elders within the Zionist community, led by the London-based Chaim Weizmann, who headed the World Zionist Organization and advocated a gradualistic approach, the partition of Palestine between Jews and Arabs, and negotiations with Britain. From this point forward, the Zionist movement would advocate for an unequivocally independent Jewish polity in Palestine, attained in cooperation with the United States. In July 1945, a report was drafted by the United States regarding the conditions of the refugees in post-World War II Europe, known as the Harrison Report. Based upon the findings within the report, the United States would request that Britain admit 100,000 Holocaust survivors into Mandatory Palestine. The report would evoke a negative response from the British, who would blame Zionist pressure for the conclusion of the report and would suggest that the United States take in a share of the refugees. This would begin negotiations between the United States and Great Britain, which would ultimately culminate in the formation of an Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry to further work toward a solution on the matter, which would convene on January 4th, 1946. The committee would approve the American recommendation to immediately accept 100,000 Jewish refugees from Europe into Palestine, and would note that the demand for a Jewish state would go beyond the obligations of the British according to the Balfour Declaration and British mandate over Palestine, stating, quote, "In order to dispose once and for all the executive claims of Jews and Arabs to Palestine, we regard it as essential that a clear statement of principle should be made that Jew shall not dominate Arab and Arab shall not dominate Jew in Palestine," unquote, noting that such demands have been explicitly rejected by the chairman of the Jewish Agency as recently as 1932. On July 31st, 1946, a joint British and American plan was announced known as the Morrison-Grady Plan, which would propose the establishment of a unitary federal trusteeship in Mandatory Palestine, whereby Jewish and Arab provinces would be given self-rule under British oversight, with Jerusalem and the Negev region remaining under British control. The Arab states would discuss this with the British at the London Conference held between September 1946 and February 1947, and would reject it based upon the fact that it would lead to the partition of Palestine, and instead proposed a single independent state. Jewish representatives would refuse to attend the conference as they had previously rejected the Provisional Autonomy Plan at the Biltmore Conference and made their attendance at the London Conference contingent upon the release of their detained leaders, a demand which the British rejected. This plan was ultimately rejected by U.S. President Harry S. Truman due to pressure from Zionists, who feared that the plan would confine their boundaries to a small enclave, leaving the U.S. with no position on Palestine. In May 1946, the British would announce the independence of the Emirate of Transjordan as the Hashemite Kingdom of Transjordan, something which would earn the objections of the Jewish Agency, with the agency stating that Transjordan was an essential component of Palestine and that the Jewish people had a vested interest in the territory, despite the exclusion of Transjordan from the territory set aside for Jewish settlement, according to the Transjordan Memorandum. In 1946, a survey of Palestine would be conducted which would rank the population across religious lines as 58.3% Muslim, 33% Jewish, 7.9% Christian, and 0.8% from various other groups. From the time of the first census in 1922 until 1947, yearly growth of the Jewish sector of the economy was 13.2%, primarily as a result of immigration and foreign capital, as opposed to a growth rate of 6.5% amongst the Arab sectors of the economy. On February 14, 1947, the British would refer the matter of mandatory Palestine to the newly formed United Nations, who on November 29, 1947, with UN General Assembly Resolution 181, would vote to end the British mandate and to partition Palestine into separate independent Jewish and Arab states linked economically, and to establish the city of Jerusalem and surrounding areas including Bethlehem to be governed by a UN-controlled corporis separatum, or international trusteeship. The proposed Arab state would include the central and western portions of the region of Galilee, including the town of Accra, the regions of Judea and Samaria, Jaffa, the southern coast of the region stretching from Ashdod to what is now the Gaza Strip, including a section of desert along the Egyptian border. The proposed Jewish state would include eastern Galilee, the coastal region which would stretch from Haifa in the north to Rehovot in the south, as well as the majority of the Negev region. At the time, the Arab population constituted roughly 2/3 of the population and owned 20% of the land, while the Jewish population constituted 1/3 and owned 6 to 7% of the land. The future Jewish state would comprise 56.47% of mandatory Palestine and contain a population of 498,000 Jews and 325,000 Arabs, while the future Arab state would comprise 43.53% of mandatory Palestine and include 807,000 Arabs and 10,000 Jews. The internationally administered territory in Jerusalem would consist of 100,000 Jews and 105,000 Arabs. According to the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, quote, the Jews will have the most economically developed part of the country, embracing practically the whole of the citrus-producing area, unquote, with citrus being Palestine's primary export crop, despite half of the citrus-bearing land being owned by Arabs. Additionally, according to British records, 84% of the irrigated and cultivable land would be in the Jewish state, with 16% in the Arab state. The Jewish Agency, the recognized representative of the Jewish community, would accept the partition plan despite opposition from the portion of the Zionist representatives, such as Irgun leader and future Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, who would state, quote, the partition of the homeland is illegal. It will never be recognized. The situation by its institutions and individuals of the partition agreement is invalid. It will not bind the Jewish people. Jerusalem was and will forever be our capital. Eretz Israel will be restored to the people of Israel. All of it and forever, unquote. Ben-Gurion, who would endorse the partition plan, would state in his war diaries in 1947, quote, every school child knows that there is no such thing as a final agreement, not with regard to the regime, not with regard to borders, not with regard to international agreements. History, like nature, is full of alterations and change, unquote. The Arab Higher Committee and Arab League rejected the plan as well as any other partition plan, citing that Arabs made up the majority of the population and owned the majority of the land, yet would receive a smaller portion of the territory. They would additionally note that the partition violated the principles of self-determination outlined in the UN Charter, which granted a people the right to determine their own future. The Arab League would demand a unitary state with an Arab majority and minority rights provided to the Jewish population, and urge Palestinians to fight the partition, pledging to provide financial and military aid in order to prevent the partition and establishment of a Jewish state. The plan would additionally be rejected by the majority of the Arab population. Despite announcing that it would accept the partition plan, Britain would refuse to enforce it on grounds that it was not accepted by the Arabs. On December 1, 1947, the Arab Higher Committee would declare a 3-day strike and riots would erupt in Jerusalem. In response to Arab attacks on Jewish areas, which would result in numerous Jewish deaths, Jewish paramilitary force Haganah would likewise respond with the use of force. The situation would descend into civil war, and 2 weeks after the UN vote, the British would announce that they would end the mandate over Palestine on May 15, 1948. In March 1948, the British cabinet would agree that civil and military authorities would not attempt to oppose the establishment of a Jewish state or the entry of Transjordan into Palestine, and both Great Britain and the United States favored the annexation of Palestinian territories by Transjordan. During the course of the Civil War, Lehi and Irgun would take part in attacks against Palestinian Arabs, such as the Deir Yassin massacre, where Irgun and Lehi forces would kill at least 107 Palestinian Arab villagers, including women and children, in a village of 600. Towards the end of the Civil War phase of the war, from April to mid-May 1948, Zionist forces would undertake an offensive later referred to as Plan Dalet, or Plan D, whereby they would militarily conquer the territory set aside for the Jewish state, as well as territory set aside by the UN Partition plan for a future Arab state, and the Corpus Separatum of Jerusalem. David Ben-Gurion had expressed sentiments in line with this strategy, writing in his war diaries in February 1948 that, quote, "The war shall give us the land. The concepts of ours and not ours are peace concepts only, and they lose their meaning during war," unquote. 250,000 to 500,000 Palestinians would flee or be expelled during the Civil War portion of the conflict. The British would terminate their mandate on May 15, 1948, and on that day, David Ben-Gurion, head of the Jewish Agency, would declare a Jewish state and issue the Israeli Declaration of Independence, forming the State of Israel. Following the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel, the Civil War would transform into a conflict between Israel and Arab states, referred to as the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, with the Arab League declaring the objective of restoring order and preventing additional bloodshed, and the armies of Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, and Iraq, as well as contingents from Yemen, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, and Sudan, entering the newly formed State of Israel, where they would take control of Arab territories and attack Israeli forces, as well as various Jewish settlements. This would prove to be just the beginning of a protracted conflict which would continue up until the present day. Tune in next time to find out more. Thank you for watching. This has been another Book of Kings video. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, subscribe, hit the bell icon to receive a notification every time I release a new video. And if you enjoy Book of Kings content and would like to support the channel, feel free to donate to the Book of Kings Patreon account. Link is provided in the description.